Imagine being on the phone with your son for 47 minutes. You can hear his footsteps, his breathing. He's lost, but he's talking to you. And then, suddenly, he says two words that will haunt you forever. Oh shit. The line goes dead, and your son is never seen again. This is the true story of Brandon Swanson's final phone call, and what happened that night is more disturbing than you could ever imagine. May 14th, 2008. Marshall, Minnesota. A small college town where nothing much ever happens. Brandon Swanson was 19 years old, a student at Minnesota West Community and Technical College. He was responsible, smart, and just a semester away from completing his degree. On this particular night, Brandon attended an end-of-year celebration with friends in Canby, a town about 30 miles from his home. It was supposed to be a normal night. A few drinks, some laughs, then home. But Brandon Swanson would never make it home. And the mystery of what happened to him would become one of the most baffling missing persons cases in American history. The party in Canby was typical for college students celebrating the end of the semester. Brandon wasn't a heavy drinker, but he did have a few beers that night. By all accounts, he was in good spirits, laughing with friends, making plans for the summer. Around midnight, Brandon decided it was time to head home. He said his goodbyes, got into his green Chevy Lamina, and started the 30-mile drive back to Marshall. The route was simple. Rural highways he'd driven dozens of times before. There was no reason to think anything would go wrong. But in the dark, on those winding country roads, everything was about to change. Somewhere along the way, Brandon made a wrong turn. It's easy to do on those rural Minnesota roads, especially at night when everything looks the same. Fields stretching endlessly in every direction. No streetlights, no landmarks, just darkness. Around 1:30 in the morning, Brandon's car went into a ditch. The exact circumstances aren't clear. There were no skid marks, no signs of excessive speed. It appeared he simply drove off the road, perhaps distracted or confused about his location. The car was stuck, but Brandon wasn't injured. The airbags didn't deploy. It seemed like a minor inconvenience. The kind of thing that happens to college kids. Call your parents, get a ride, deal with the car in the morning. At 1:54 a.m., Brandon called his parents. His father, Brian Swanson, answered the phone. Brandon explained the situation calmly. He'd run into a ditch. The car wouldn't move. He needed them to come pick him up. When Brian asked where he was, Brandon said he was just outside of Lind, a small town between Canby and Marshall. He could see the lights of the town. He knew exactly where he was. Or at least, he thought he did. Brian and his wife Annette got dressed, got in their car, and headed toward Lind. It should have been simple. Drive to Lind, find their son, bring him home. But when they arrived in Lind, there was no sign of Brandon. No car. No flashing headlights. Nothing. Brian called Brandon back. They stayed on the phone. Brian and Annette drove slowly through Lind, honking their horn. Brandon flashed his headlights, but they couldn't see each other. It made no sense. If Brandon was in Lind, they should be able to see his lights. If they were in Lind honking, he should hear them. Something was wrong. Brandon was absolutely certain he was near Lind. He described what he could see. Fields. A few scattered lights in the distance. But his parents couldn't find him. The confusion was growing. Where was their son? Now, here's where this story takes a turn that will make your blood run cold. Because Brandon wasn't near Lind at all. In fact, he was nowhere close. He was actually 25 miles away in a completely different direction. But how could that be? How could someone be so utterly wrong about their location? And more importantly, what Brandon was about to walk into in those dark fields would ensure he'd never be seen again. Stay with me, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about this case. After searching for nearly 45 minutes with no success, Brandon made a decision. He told his parents he was going to walk toward the lights he could see. He believed these were the lights of Lind. In reality, he was looking at the small town of Taunton, in the opposite direction from where his parents were searching. Brandon started walking, and he kept his father on the phone. For the next 47 minutes, Brian Swanson would listen to his son's journey through the dark Minnesota countryside. He could hear Brandon's footsteps, his breathing, the rustle of movement through fields. Brandon seemed calm, confident even. He knew where he was going. He'd be there soon. Brandon walked through the darkness, describing what he could see. fields of crops, fences. At one point, he mentioned he was walking along roads, then through fields again. He told his father he could see the lights getting closer. He was making progress. Brian and Annette continued to drive around, still honking, still searching. The frustration in their voices must have been evident, but Brandon remained upbeat. This would all be over soon. He'd reach the town, they'd find him, and they'd all go home. It was just taking longer than expected. Minnesota nights in May can be cold, around 40 degrees, but Brandon didn't complain. He just kept walking, kept talking, kept moving toward what he thought was rescue. At some point during the walk, Brandon told his father he was going to have to cross some fences and possibly a river. His path toward the lights was taking him through increasingly difficult terrain, but he seemed undeterred. He was young, physically fit. A few obstacles weren't going to stop him. What's chilling in retrospect is that Brandon was likely navigating in complete darkness, with only his cell phone for light. The area he was walking through was completely rural. No street lights, no houses nearby, just endless fields and the occasional road. And somewhere in that darkness, there were hazards Brandon couldn't possibly see. It was now approximately 2:30 in the morning. Brandon had been walking for about 35 to 40 minutes. He was still on the phone with his father, still describing his progress. And then, suddenly, Brandon said something that would echo in his parents' minds forever. "Oh shit." 2 words. That's all. The phone line went dead. Just like that. 47 minutes of conversation. 47 minutes of hearing their son's voice. And then silence. Brian immediately tried calling back. The phone rang but went to voicemail. He tried again. And again. Nothing. Brandon's phone was either off, dead, or destroyed. Their son was gone. So what happened in that moment? What did Brandon see that made him exclaim in surprise? And where did he go? Here's what makes this case absolutely terrifying. Despite one of the most extensive searches in Minnesota history, not a single trace of Brandon Swanson has ever been found. No body, no clothing, no phone, nothing. It's as if he vanished into thin air. And the theories about what happened? They range from tragic accident to something far more sinister. But before we get to those theories, you need to understand just how wrong Brandon was about his location. When morning came and Brandon still hadn't been found, the search intensified. Law enforcement got involved. And that's when they made a shocking discovery. Brandon's car was found in a ditch, exactly as he'd described. But it wasn't near Lind. It wasn't even close. The car was located near the town of Taunton, approximately 25 miles in the opposite direction from where Brandon thought he was. How does someone become that disoriented? Brandon had driven these roads before. He knew the area. Yet somehow, he'd ended up miles from where he believed himself to be, and he'd walked even further in the wrong direction. Search teams brought in tracking dogs. The dogs picked up Brandon's scent at his vehicle and tracked it for about 3 miles. The trail led through fields, exactly as Brandon had described to his father. The dogs followed the scent to the Yellow Medicine River. And there, at the riverbank, the trail went cold. The dogs lost the scent completely. It was as if Brandon had simply ceased to exist at that spot. This discovery led many to believe Brandon had fallen into the river, possibly in the darkness, and drowned. The "oh shit" could have been his realization that he was falling. But there are problems with this theory. Big problems. The Yellow Medicine River at that location is not a massive, raging river. It's relatively shallow in many places, especially in May. If Brandon had fallen in, even if he'd hit his head and been unconscious, his body should have been found. The river was extensively searched. Dive teams went down. The riverbanks were scoured for miles. Nothing. Additionally, Brandon was a good swimmer. Even if he'd fallen in the dark, the river wasn't so dangerous that an athletic 19-year-old couldn't have made it to the bank. And if he drowned, the body would have surfaced eventually. Bodies in water almost always do. But Brandon's never did. Another theory suggests Brandon fell into an abandoned well, cistern, or agricultural hole in one of the fields. Rural Minnesota has many such hazards, often hidden by crops or vegetation. A fall into one of these could explain the "oh shit" and the sudden end to the call. It could explain why his body was never found, if the hole was deep or concealed. Search teams did look for such openings, but the area is vast. Thousands of acres of farmland. It would be nearly impossible to search every square foot. To this day, there could be an unmarked hole somewhere in those fields, with Brandon at the bottom. But even this theory has issues. Why wouldn't searchers with ground-penetrating radar have found something? But there's another set of theories. Darker theories. Theories that suggest Brandon didn't die by accident at all. Because there's something about this case that doesn't quite add up. Why was Brandon so confused about his location? Why did he seem so confident about where he was when he was completely wrong? Some people believe Brandon wasn't alone out there in those fields. And what happened to him might not have been an accident at all. Let me tell you why some investigators think there's more to this story than a tragic wrong turn. Brandon had been drinking that night, but he wasn't drunk. Multiple witnesses at the party confirmed he'd had a few beers over several hours. He was coherent on the phone with his father for nearly an hour. His speech wasn't slurred. He wasn't stumbling or confused in his conversation. Yet he was completely, utterly wrong about his location. 25 miles wrong. Some have suggested he had a medical episode, a stroke or seizure that affected his spatial reasoning. But he was only 19 and had no history of medical problems. Others have proposed he was drugged at the party, something that would explain his disorientation. But there's no evidence of this, and his behavior on the phone seemed relatively normal. A smaller group of people believe Brandon encountered someone in those fields. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who might have been engaged in illegal activity, drug manufacturing or smuggling, perhaps. The "oh shit" was Brandon's realization he'd stumbled onto something dangerous. This theory suggests Brandon was killed to keep him quiet, and his body was hidden or destroyed. It's dark, and there's not much evidence for it, but it would explain certain things. The absolute lack of any physical evidence. The sudden end to the call. The fact that an extensive search found nothing at all. But this theory requires assuming the worst of humanity, and most investigators don't believe it's what happened. The search for Brandon Swanson was massive. Law enforcement, volunteers, search and rescue teams all combed the area for weeks. They used helicopters, ATVs, search dogs, divers, and ground-penetrating radar. They searched fields, rivers, ponds, abandoned buildings. They interviewed everyone who'd been at the party. They analyzed cell phone records. Brandon's last known cell phone ping was consistent with the area where his car was found. There were no pings after the call ended, suggesting his phone died or was destroyed at that moment. The search eventually became the largest missing person search in Minnesota history up to that point. And still, nothing. Brandon's parents, Brian and Annette, refused to give up. They couldn't. They pushed for changes to how law enforcement handles missing person cases. You see, when Brandon first disappeared, police said they had to wait before starting an official search because Brandon was an adult. There was no evidence of foul play. He could have just walked away. This delay, however short, might have cost precious time. In 2009, Minnesota passed Brandon's law. This law requires law enforcement to immediately begin a preliminary investigation when an adult under 21 is reported missing under dangerous circumstances, without waiting for the typical 24 or 48 hours. It's Brandon's legacy, potentially saving other families from the same nightmare. So, where is Brandon Swanson? More than 15 years have passed, and the answer remains as elusive as ever. His parents still search. They've never stopped hoping for answers. Every year, on the anniversary of his disappearance, they renew their calls for information. Somewhere in those Minnesota fields, there might be a clue, a piece of evidence that was missed. Or perhaps Brandon is somewhere no one thought to look, in a place so obvious it was overlooked. The truth is, we may never know what happened in those final moments. Why Brandon said, "oh shit." Where he went. How he vanished so completely. But his story remains a chilling reminder of how quickly someone can disappear, even while connected to loved ones on the phone. If you have any information about Brandon Swanson's disappearance, please get in touch with the Marshall Police Department or the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. Someone out there might know something, might have seen something that night, might have information that could finally bring closure to a family that has waited far too long for answers. Brandon Swanson was 19 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. And on a dark May night in 2008, he walked into the Minnesota countryside and was never seen again. His final words still echo, "oh shit." What did he see? What happened to him? The mystery remains unsolved.